So today we are going to look at the thalamus. The thalamus is part of the diencephalon. And you remember our forebrain was made up of two vesicles, two secondary vesicles, the telencephalon, which forms the cerebrum, and the diencephalon, which forms the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and part of the eyes. So today we are going to look at the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon. So, thalamus is singular. Thalami is plural. So we have two thalami. One in the core of the right hemisphere and another one in the core of the left hemisphere. So there are two. They are ovoid in shape. They are ovoid in shape. And they are connected by a structure known as the intermediate mass or mass intermedia. On their posterior aspect, they are enlarged because of four enlargements. Two on the posterior aspect of the right thalamus and two on the posterior aspect of the left thalamus. And when you add both the ones, the enlargements on the posterior aspect of the right thalamus and the posterior enlargements on the posterior aspect of the right thalamus, they become four, and those enlargements, we call them the corpora quadrigemina, four bodies, as we shall see. So when you scan the brain, because you cannot look at the thalamus when you're looking at the brain externally, on the core of the brain, we have two oval structures, one on the right, another one on the left, and those are known as the thalami, and they are connected in between by what we call the intermediate mass. When you make a midline sagittal plane through the brain, passing through the medial longitudinal fissure, when you make a sagittal plane passing through the medial longitudinal fissure, that is the median sagittal plane, you're going to see the medial aspects of each hemisphere. And on the medial aspect of each hemisphere, you're going to see the thalamus clearly. For example, this is a median sagittal plane of the brain looking at the medial aspect of one hemisphere. And when you look at the medial aspect of one hemisphere, you're going to see the cerebrum up there. Below it, you're going to see the corpus callosum, which I talked about. And below the corpus callosum, you're going to see this structure. This structure is known as the cavum septum pellucidum. Deep to it is the lateral ventricle. So this is a membrane known as the cavum septum pellucidum. It is below the corpus callosum. And then this is what we call the fornix. I don't know whether Mr. Chagulanyi will talk about the limbic system, but the fornix is made up of nerve axons, which are part of the limbic system. But even before he looks at the limbic system, you can go and read about the limbic system. This structure is the fornix. And then below the fornix is one of the thalami. It's oval. Remember, this is a median sagittal plane showing you the medial aspect of the hemispheres. And you're going to see the cerebrum, especially this gyrus, known as the cingulate gyrus of the cerebrum, the corpus callosum, the cavum septum pellucidum, deep to it where you'll find the lateral ventricle, the fornix, which is part of the limbic system, and then below it you have our oval thalamus. Anterior-inferior to the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus. And anterior-inferior to the hypothalamus, you have the stalk of the pituitary gland and then the pituitary gland. These relations are very important for you. Anterior-inferior to the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus, and anterior-inferior to the hypothalamus, you have the stalk and of the pituitary gland and then the pituitary gland. The other name for the pituitary gland is known as the hypophysis cerebri. Hypophysis cerebri. Now, superior to the pituitary gland, you have the optic chiasma. This is the optic chiasma. I believe we have looked at the optic nerve. This is where the optic chiasma is, but we have cut through it in sagittal section. That is why you see that when you have tumors of the pituitary gland, the tumors are going to compress the optic chiasma and you're going to have visual deficits. Anterior to the thalamus, you have the anterior commissure. This anterior commissure is just connecting mainly the two olfactory bulbs. The olfactory bulb on the right and the olfactory bulb on the left are connected by nerve axons which are passing through the anterior commissure. A commissure means that it has fibers which are crossing from one side to another and vice versa. And then here we are having our posterior commissure. These fibers within the posterior commissure connecting the posterior aspects of the cerebrum from the right to the left and from the left to the right. And then our pineal gland, which is there. So these are the relations of the thalamus. Superior, you have the fornix. Anterior, you have the anterior commissure. Posterior, you have the pineal gland. Inferior, you have the posterior commissure and the cerebral aqueduct. This cerebral aqueduct picks cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle, which is in this region, to the fourth ventricle, which is here. Anterior inferior, you have the hypothalamus. So inferior, you have the cerebral aqueduct, means that this is the midbrain, because the cerebral part of the ventricular system, which passes through the midbrain. So these images, when you look at them and study them, at the end of the day, you will master the different parts of the brain in the median, sagittal plane, and their order. And today we are looking at our thalamus. And remember, this is only one thalamus in one hemisphere, visualized from the medial aspect of the hemisphere. So when you extract the two thalami, I say that one have a thalamus there on the left and the thalamus on the right, and they are connected together by the intermediate mass. And the thalamus is split by a Y-shaped strand of white matter. Each thalamus is split by a Y-shaped strand of white matter. And this strand of white matter, known as the lamina, contains axons of neurons which are connecting the thalamus to other parts of the brain. The split is anterior. So this is the anterior aspect of the thalamus. And this is the posterior aspect of the thalamus. So two thalami ovoid connected by the intermediate mass, containing a Y-shaped strand of white matter, where the two limbs of the Y are facing the anterior aspect. And this Y-shaped limb of white matter contains axons of the neurons of the thalamus, connecting the thalamus to the different parts of the brain. And we say that the reason we have white matter is that the axons have a myelin sheath, which is covered by glycoprotein, and the glycoprotein is white. That's why where you have axons, you have white matter. So still, this is showing us our two thalami and the intermediate mass. Another point, this thalamus is in one hemisphere and the other thalamus is in one hemisphere, And this is where you make the median sagittal plane when you're looking at the medial aspect of the hemisphere. So you're going to see this thalamus on one hemisphere and this thalamus in the other hemisphere. Now, the space between the two thalami, this space is above and below the intermediate mass. The space between the two thalami is the third ventricle. It is the third ventricle. This is the Y-shaped lamina, and this is the anterior aspect. This is the posterior aspect of the thalamus. So principally, those are the introductory notes of how the thalamus looks like and where it's part of the diencephalon. Now, we shall see the thalamus in detail. So when you make a median sagittal plane through the median longitudinal fissure, you're going to visualize the medial aspect of the hemisphere, and I showed you what you see, and here they are labeled very well. Our fornix, our thalamus, our anterior commissure, our hypothalamus, our midbrain here, and the cerebral aqueduct, and the posterior commissure inferiorly. Posterior, you have the pineal gland. This structure is the choroid plexus, because in this region between the two thalami, we have the third ventricle. So this choroid plexus is the one which produces cerebrospinal fluid. It's capillary network. It is the one which produces cerebrospinal fluid in this region of the third ventricle, and that cerebrospinal fluid will then proceed to enter the cerebral aqueduct, and then from there proceed to the fourth ventricle and up to the central canal of the spinal cord. So in the region of the thalami, between the two thalami, you have the third ventricle. This is the intermediate mass which we sectioned as we are making a sagittal section. Please make sure that you master this image and the labels, and you can identify where the different parts are located. Don't forget that the optic chiasma looks like that when we cut through it in sagittal section, and it is superior to the pituitary gland, especially the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And the other name for the pituitary gland is the hypophysis cerebri. Of course, we have to look at the other structures, the other parts of the brain which are surrounding the thalamus, because we have to appreciate the gross region where it is located. Someone, which plane is this? Is it transverse? Is it sagittal? Is it coronal? Is it transverse? Is it sagittal? Is it coronal? Because that is the first question we ask before we even talk about the image. Is it transverse? Is it sagittal? Is it coronal? This image.
That is coronal.
This is a coronal.
Okay.
At this level, if you don't know the planes, you had better go and revise the planes. This is a coronal plane. This one is a sagittal, and this is a coronal. And the coronal plane shows you both hemispheres. A right, a left, a median longitudinal fissure, and the corpus callosum. So below you can see a thalamus in this hemisphere and the thalamus in this hemisphere. When you enlarge this region, you're going to see this is the corpus callosum, and these are the fornix. The fornices are two, one on the right, one on the left. Now here we have cut through the coronal section. You're seeing both fornices, because when you look at this is one fornix, but there's another fornix on the other hemisphere. So when you make a coronal section, you cut through both of them. So we go here. These are the fornices, one on the right and the other one on the left, and the corpus callosum is there. So this is the thalamus on the right, and this is the thalamus, this entire structure. This is the thalamus on the right, on the left, and this is the thalamus on the right, and the space between them is the third ventricle. Below the thalamus, There are structures which we are not seeing clearly in the sagittal section. This is what we call the subthalamic nucleus. Below the thalamus, have what we call the subthalamic nucleus, and then we have this red nucleus in the midbrain. You remember the cerebrospinal tract. And then we have this structure containing melanin. It's black. They call it substantia nigra. So below the thalamus, you have these structures. You are not able to see them in sagittal. They are below the structure. They are inside the core of the brain, of the brain, but below the thalamus. But you cannot clearly see them. But below the brain, you can see the midbrain. But inside this midbrain, on the core of the midbrain, you have what you call the red nucleus and a substantia nigra, or black substance, because it has melanin. And we shall look at them when we have our subsequent lecture. But immediately below the thalamus is what we call the subthalamic nucleus. And then these two are in the midbrain, the red nucleus and the substantia nigra. So what we are trying to see is that in between the two thalami, the one on the left and the one on the right, we have that part of the ventricular system known as the third ventricle. We are going to concentrate so much on students being able to identify the different parts of the brain in sagittal, coronal, transverse, and oblique. You must be in position to identify the different parts of the brain in the different planes: sagittal, coronal, transverse, and oblique. Because each of those planes brings out certain things more clear than the other. That's why you have to visualize the brain in different planes. So you had better begin looking at the parts of the brain in those different planes when there is still time. Who can tell me what is this plane? Is it coronal? Is it sagittal? Is it transverse?
Transverse.
Transverse.
It is transverse.
When you make a transverse plane. So you're going to see a thalamus on the right, a thalamus on the left, the third ventricle in the middle, and we can see that the third ventricle is communicating with the lateral ventricles. These are lateral ventricles. Remember, the lateral ventricles have an anterior portion and a posterior portion. So here we are seeing the third ventricle connecting with the anterior portions of the lateral ventricles through what we call the interventricular foramen. So our third ventricle connects with the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen. But our objective today is to show that even in the transverse section, you can see both the thalami and the third ventricle in between them. This might be the pineal gland, which projects posteriorly. And these are the lateral ventricles that we call them anterior horns because they are the anterior portions of the lateral ventricles. And in between them, we have what we call the septum pellucidum. That's the septum pellucidum. But this septum pellucidum curves above the thalami, but here we're just cutting through a piece of it. And that's what I told you, that deep to the septum pellucidum, you have the lateral ventricles. So what we are doing is that they are making a transverse section through this anterior portion of the septum pellucidum. Because you see the thalamus is here, but septum pellucidum is both anterior and superior. So when we make a transverse section, we pass through this. You see, a transverse section, you pass through the frontal lobe, you pass through the corpus callosum, you pass through the anterior portion of the septum pellucidum, and a bit of the fornix there, and then the thalamus. So when you're making a transverse section like that, what do you go through? Which structures do you go through anterior to the thalamus? The cerebrum, the corpus callosum, the anterior portion of the cavum septum pellucidum, the anterior portion of the fornix, and then the thalamus. So when you go to the transverse section, you're going to see the cerebrum, the corpus callosum, the anterior portion of the cavum septum pellucidum, the anterior portion of the fornix, and then our thalami are there. So the more you visualize the thalamus, the better you become. So we have seen how the thalamus looks like in sagittal, in coronal, and in transverse. And I want to go and continue visualizing those images and appreciating. When you look at the thalamus in sagittal section, what do you see? When you look at the thalamus in transverse section, what do you see? When you look at the thalamus in coronal section, what do you see? And what structures are surrounding the thalamus, or what are the relations of the thalamus? We talked about the thalamus when we are looking at the ascending and descending tracts, and we say that the thalamus is a relay center. A relay center is a region which receives from or where other parts transmit to. It is a region where other parts transmit to, or a region which receives from. For example, all ascending tracts except the olfactory must first transmit their sensations or impulses to the thalamus, where they will synapse with third order neurons, and the third order neurons will then transmit those impulses to the other parts of the brain or the higher centers, except the olfactory. Even when the information is motor related, because there is the parts of the brain like the basal ganglia and cerebellum, we are going to have lectures on basal ganglia and cerebellum. Parts of the brain like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, when they are trying to transmit information to the motor areas of the cortex, they have to also transmit that information through the thalamus. So even if the information is motor related, it must first go through the thalamus, except the olfactory. So it's a relay center. You do not go to the cerebrum without passing through the thalamus. You do not go to the cerebrum without passing through the thalamus, except the olfactory impulses. That's why they say it's a relay center. That's why you're seeing that information is being taken to the thalamus, and from the thalamus will be transmitted to the other parts of the brain. That's why they call it the relay center. And we saw it when we were looking at the ascending tracts, which are transmitting information to the cerebrum for interpretation or for perception. But we shall also see even other parts of the brain which are related to with motor coordination. If they are transmitting their information to the motor areas of the cortex to coordinate movement, they must also first go through the thalamus. So that's how the thalamus is important. When it is injured, you kind of cut off from the cerebrum because it is the gateway. It is very, very important. The right thalamus, the left thalamus, connected by the intermediate mass, and in between them we have the third ventricle, and it is a relay center. This is just an example of second order neurons crossing the opposite side and ascending. For example, this one might be the anterior or lateral spinal thalamic tract to the thalamus, where they synapse with third order neurons, and then third order neurons transmit those impulses to the cortex, passing through the internal capsule and the corona radiata. Just this is what we mean by what we call the relay center. First, go to the thalamus. The thalamus will connect you through third order neurons to the cortex. It is the relay center. It is the gateway to the cortex. Now, there are areas known as the basal ganglia. Take an example. These are our basal ganglia, but we are going to look at them in detail. These are just parts of the basal ganglia. And now this is part of the cerebellum. These two, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, work hand in hand with the motor areas of the cortex to coordinate movement. But to connect with the motor areas of the cortex, this basal ganglia must first transmit their information to the thalamus, and then the thalamus will transmit that information to the motor areas about the planned movements of these two, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Then you perform movements. So they do not connect directly. They must first go through the thalamus and then transmit that information. So the thalamus not only receives sensory information as we saw in the ascending tracts, but also receives motor-related information on its way to the motor cortex, which is involved in motor coordination, as we shall see when we have our lecture on the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Now, this is another point. We have seen that the thalamus receives a lot of information which is on its way to the cerebrum. Some of that information is motor. Some of that information is sensory, but even the sensory is segmented. It can be vibratory sense. It can be visual from the optic nerve. It can be auditory from the vestibulocochlear nerve. So because the thalamus receives a variety of sensory modalities, it must be organized. Because it receives a variety of sensory modalities, it must be organized. The region of the thalamus where visual impulses go is different from the region of the thalamus where motor impulses go. So that is why the thalamus is segmented into different portions, proportions, or different regions known as nuclei. The thalamus is segmented into different proportions known as nuclei. For example, this is one of the thalamus. You see, it is segmented into different portions. These are different portions. These are what we call thalamic nuclei. A nucleus in the central nervous system, a nucleus is not a membrane-bound organelle with DNA, no. In the central nervous system, a nucleus is a group of neurons which coordinate a specific function. When they talk about thalamic nuclei or cranial nerve nuclei, we are talking about a group of neurons in one region which coordinate a particular function. So if we say that this is the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus, there is a group of neurons in this region which coordinate a particular function. If we say that this is the lateral geniculate body, it's another nucleus, it is a group of neurons which coordinate a particular function. If we say this is a pulvinar, it is another nucleus. It is a group of neurons which coordinate a particular function. So because the thalamus receives a variety of information, both motor and sensory, and even the sensory are of varieties, it must be organized into regions known as nuclei. And each of those regions receives a specific sensation or impulse type. Where visual stimuli, which are going to the occipital lobe of the cortex, where they go, that region of the thalamus is different from where auditory go. Where information from the cerebellum and basal ganglia, which is motor related, where it goes, it's a different region from where information coming in through the ascending tracts goes. So those different nuclei of the thalamus are the specific regions within the thalamus where the stimuli of different modalities go. The different modalities or different sensations or stimuli do not go to the same region. No, the thalamus segments them that these are motor, they go this side. These are visually they go in this portion. So the thalamus, in simple terms, has departments. The visual department is where the impulses from the optic nerve are going. The auditory department is the nucleus where the auditory impulses are going before they reach the cerebrum. The genosensory department is where impulses through the ascending tracts goes. The motor department is where information related to motor goes. And those different divisions, which I've called departments for simplicity, are the ones we call the thalamic nuclei. So it is that organized. Now, how do we classify the nuclei of the thalamus? How do we classify the nuclei of the thalamus? We have two types of classification. You can classify the nuclei of the thalamus anatomically, depending on their position. You can also classify them physiologically, depending on their function. And those two classifications supplement each other. The anatomical classification supplements the physiological, and the physiological supplements the anatomical. But first, let us understand each of those classifications. So the anatomical classification is going to classify the thalamus according to its location, generally. When they say that nuclei are intralamina, they say they are inside that white lamina. That's why they say intralamina nuclei, because they are on the inside of that lamina. When they say they are medial, they are medial to the lamina. They are near to the midline. When we say they are lateral to the lamina. When we say they are posterior, they are on the posterior aspect of the thalamus. Midline nuclei are the ones in the region of the intermediate mass. For example, this is one thalamus. This is the lamina containing axons of thalamic neurons. And the split of the Y is anterior, so this is the posterior aspect. This is the anterior aspect. This is the posterior aspect. This is the medial aspect. This is the lateral aspect. So these are the posterior nuclei. These are the lateral nuclei. These are the medial nuclei, which are colored green. And these are the midline nuclei, which are colored red. Why do they call these nuclei lateral? Because they are lateral to this lamina. Why do they call these nuclei medial? Now we shall see that even this one, which is anterior, is part of the medial, okay? Why do they call this nuclei medial? Because they are medial to the lamina. Why do they call this nuclei midline? Because they are in the region of the intermediate mass attachment. Why do they call these nuclei posterior? Because they are on the posterior aspect of the thalamus. And there's another special nucleus, this one, it is lateral. We shall look at it, it's known as the reticular nucleus. So the midline nuclei, they are located on the medial surface of the thalamus near the midline. And these are the ones we have used to color red. These are the midline nuclei. Intralaminar nuclei, they are on the inside of the lamina, which is the septum. They are on the inside of this lamina. When you look at this illustration, this is the lamina. They are on the inside of the lamina. They are the intralaminar nuclei. Medial mass of nuclei, The medial mass of nuclei is on the medial aspect of the lamina. It has specifically two nuclei, the anterior nucleus and the dorsomedial nucleus. The anterior nucleus and the dorsomedial nucleus. And when you look at them, it's here. The anterior nucleus and the dorsomedial nucleus, because they are medial to the lamina, these two are the medial group of nuclei. These are the midline. Then these are the medial, the anterior nucleus and the dorsomedial, because they are medial to this lamina. We usually use the lateral limb. Then we are having our lateral. The lateral has more nuclei. We have the dorsal, which are above, and the ventral, which are below. When you go back to the lateral, you have the dorsal, which are above, and the ventral, which are below. So these are the lateral. The dorsal and the ones which are below, which are ventral. Those are the ones we call the lateral nuclei. The dorsolateral, posterolateral. Those are the dorsal, which you have seen here. The dorsolateral and the posterolateral. These are the dorsal nuclei on the lateral aspect. Because I said the lateral group of nuclei has a dorsal and a ventral. The dorsal will have the dorsolateral and a posterolateral. Dorsal but lateral. Posterior but lateral. Then we have the ventral because they are below. Ventral anterior, ventral lateral. Then we have the ventral posterolateral. Deep to it we have the ventral posteromedial. These are the ventral nuclei. These are the dorsal nuclei. Dorsal means above, ventral means below. And all of them are part of the lateral mass of thalamic nuclei. Medial we have anterior and dorsomedial. Midline we have the midline. And the posterior nuclei we have what we call the pulvinar, the lateral gingivate body. Those who have looked at the optic nerve, you know the lateral gingivate body. Medial gingivate body, those ones who have looked at the auditory nerve. These are what we call the posterior. Then we have this reticular nucleus. It is not grouped so much in anywhere, but when you look at it, it might fit within lateral, but we look at it in a special way. It's known as the thalamic reticular nucleus, and we shall see its significance. So that is how they classify the thalamic nuclei anatomically. What is on the right is the same as what is on the left. Lateral, divided into dorsal and ventral, posterior, medial, and midline. And each group, it is segmented into different nuclei, which we have mentioned. The posterior having 3, the medial having 2, then the midline it's 1, and then the lateral has 2 dorsal and 4 ventral. Now, the posterior, we have talked about the posterior pulvinar, medial gingivate body, and lateral gingivate body. These two, medial gingivate body and lateral gingivate body, are the ones we call the metathalamus. They are medial gingivate body and lateral gingivate body. Then this thalamic reticular nucleus is given a special consideration, but we shall look at it separately, but it's part of the nuclei of the thalamus. After classifying these nuclei anatomically through the, you can see here the lateral group, the dorsal are above, the ventral are below. You can see the posterior, pulvinar, and the gingivate bodies, which are the metathalamus. We can see the medial. This anterior is part of the medial, and the midline are deep there near the intermediate mass. What is on the right is the same as what is on the left. Now, How do we classify those anatomical nuclei according to their function? When this classification is known as bundle classification. When we are classifying thalamic nuclei according to their function, we classify them according to which type of sensation goes there. When they say that specific sensory relay nucleus, it means that these nuclei only receive sensory stimuli. Specific motor nuclei, these nuclei of the thalamus only receive motor stimuli, which are on their way, of course, to the cerebral. Association or less specific nuclei. When we talked about the cerebrum, there are areas we talked about association area. Association area. So it means that these nuclei receive information which is going to go to the association areas of the cerebrum. You go back and look at those association areas. Non-specific. Now, the information going to this nuclei of the thalamus is coming from scattered regions, non-specific. It comes from anywhere, from the brain, scattered. Comes from almost everywhere. That's why they are non-specific, that they are not receiving information from this region to that region. Limbic nuclei. I urge you to go and read about the limbic system and what the parts of the limbic system and its functions. And I told you that the phonics is part of the limbic system. So information coming or going to the limbic system, coming to the thalamus from or towards the limbic system, is going to go to the specific nuclei of the thalamus, which are known as the limbic system nuclei. For example, specific sensory relay nuclei. These nuclei only receive sensory stimuli. And under specific sensory nuclei, we have the ventral posterior nucleus. This ventral posterior nucleus, is it part of the medial group of nuclei or lateral group of nuclei?
Lateral group.
This ventral posterior nucleus, let's go back and see. This is the lateral group of nuclei. So we have this nucleus known as the ventral posterior nucleus. The ventral posterior nucleus is divided into ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial. So all this is the ventral posterior nucleus. So this ventral posterior nucleus is part of the lateral group of nuclei. But we have classified it under specific sensory because it only receives sensory stimuli on their way to the cerebrum. That is why most of the ascending tracts which are bringing sensory stimuli to the thalamus come here, because those ascending tracts contains sensory. So this receives sensory stimuli only, specifically from the ascending tracts, the ventral posterior, which has the ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial. The medial geniculate body and lateral geniculate body, which group of nuclei do they fall under? Medial, lateral, or posterior?
It's posterior.
Posterior. Because when you go back and you see, the medial geniculate body is there, lateral geniculate body is there. They are in the posterior group of nuclei. The ventral posterior is in the lateral, but we have brought them together because they only receive sensory related stimuli, much as this one is in the lateral and this one is in the posterior anatomically, but functionally we bring them together because they only receive sensory stimuli. The stimuli going there are only sensory. General sensations to the ventroposterior, and these two portions. Auditory information is also sensory. Auditory information will go to the medial genital body. The vestibulocochlear nerve will transmit the auditory information to the medial genital body, from where it will be picked and taken to the temporal lobe. But this one receives auditory stimuli, and the lateral genital body receives visual on their way to the occipital lobe. So the auditory, the visual, and the general sensations, all those are sensations. And these nuclei only receive sensory impulses. That's why they call them sense-specific sensory relay nuclei. When you go back and look at the optic nerve, you must, in the circuit, there must be a lateral genital body, because from the optic chiasma, impulses are transmitted to the lateral genital body, and from the lateral genital body, we go to the occipital lobe. So because this one receives visual, which are sensory only, it is under specific sensory. Even when you look at the vestibulocochlear nerve, the medial genital body must come in, because it is that part of the thalamus which receives auditory impulses before they go to the cerebrum, temporal lobe. And because it only receives auditory and they are sensory, it qualifies to be under specific sensory. And the ventroposterior, which is divided into ventroposterolateral and ventroposterior medial, receives information from the ascending tracts, and because information from the ascending tracts is sensory, it is specific sensory. So we are getting nuclei from different anatomical regions, but bringing them together because they share a specific function. That is how the physiological classification looks like. So the functions of this is to project send two sensory, they send sensory signals, general sensations, visual, auditory, to the cerebral cortex. So information from those nuclei is now sent to the sensory areas of the cortex. Specific motor. It means that these nuclei receive only motor-related information. Last time we saw that the motor areas of the brain are very important in stimulating our muscles to contract. But to organize those movements so that they move with purpose, there are two areas of the brain which are in that plan, so that your muscles only contract when they are supposed to contract and only move in the direction they are supposed to move. That is the organization. So the organization bit of our movements is contributed for by the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. The word corpus striatum falls under basal ganglia. So the corpus striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum contribute to our motor activities in such a way that their contribution enables our muscles to move with precision and with order. That is why if the cerebellum and the basal ganglia are injured, you're going to have disorganized movements. But your movements are organized because your brain, part known as the cerebellum and the corpus striatum, are the ones which add that order into your movements. Much as is the cerebral motor areas of the cerebrum which cause your muscles to contract, but they must work hand in hand with the cerebellum and the corpus striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia, so that your movements move with order. So these two parts of the brain, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, must transmit their information of orderly movement to the motor areas of the cortex. But they also have to first go to the thalamus. They transmit that information to the thalamus, and then the thalamus will transmit it to the motor areas. So the specific nuclei of the thalamus, which receive only motor-related impulses from the cerebellum and the corpus striatum, because the impulses coming from there are motor-related. So those nuclei of the thalamus, which receive motor-related stimuli, only motor-related stimuli, you call them specific motor nuclei, and they are two, the ventral-anterior and the ventral-lateral. The ventral-anterior and the ventral-lateral. And when we are talking about the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, we shall talk about the ventral-anterior and the ventral-lateral. These are specific motor relay Nuclei. Then we have the association nuclei or the specific nuclei. Association. Now, these ones receive input from other thalamic nuclei. Inside the thalamus, there are interconnections. So these association nuclei receive information from different nuclei of the thalamus and other parts of the brain. They receive information from thalamic nuclei and other parts of the brain, and then they transmit that information to the association or secondary areas of the cerebral cortex. So information coming to these association nuclei is going to be transmitted to the association or secondary areas of the cerebral cortex. You go back and look at those secondary areas. We looked at them in that lecture for the cerebrum. What are they? The dorsolateral. You remember the dorsolateral? The posterolateral. These are dorsal. Let's see them. The dorsolateral and the posterolateral. These are association nuclei. Then we have the pulvina. The pulvina is part of the posterior nucleus. This is the pulvina. You can see the posterior nucleus as the lateral genital body, medial genital body. These are under specific sensory. Then the pulvina and these two, the dorsolateral, posterolateral, are association, because for them, their information is going to association areas. And then part of the dorsomedial, but the major ones are dorsolateral, posterolateral, and the pulvina. Those are the ones known as association areas because of their function. Association nuclei of the thalamus because of their function. Then there are non-specific nuclei. Non-specific. These ones, afferent means that information coming in. So these ones receive information from the reticular formation. I talked about a network of neurons in the brainstem. A network of neurons in the brainstem which can be stimulated by any impulse to awake you so that you are aroused. Right now you are awake because that network of neurons in the brainstem, known as the reticular formation, is being activated by sound, by light, by noise. So that network of neurons in the brainstem connects to the entire brain to arouse it to awake. It's known as the reticular formation. So the non-specific nuclei receive information from the reticular formation and also from the cerebral cortex. You can imagine, even the cerebral cortex sends to them. Then they get this information and transmit it to scattered areas of the cerebral cortex. They transmit it to the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, everywhere. Information coming to this nuclei of the thalamus is going to be taken to all areas of the cerebral cortex, but for the purpose of arousal, to awake you. So information coming from this nuclei is going to go to the entire cerebral cortex to awake it so that you are awake, or you are aroused, or you are alert. And that is why these nuclei are important, because if they are injured, you're going to go into coma. So the midline nuclei, the intralaminar nuclei, and reticular nuclei, which we saw here. These are the midline nuclei, the intralaminar, which are inside the lamina, and this one, which is the reticular nucleus. Information coming from this nuclei of the thalamus is going to be transmitted to all parts of the cerebral cortex for purposes of awaking it and arousing it. Those are the ones they call the non-specific nuclei, because they go to all areas of the cerebral cortex, non-specific ones. Specific, for example, information coming from the Lateral gingival body is going to the occipital lobe. But the one from the non-specific is going to all lobes of the cerebrum to awake it. The limbic system nuclei will have the anterior nucleus and then the dorsolateral nucleus. Part of this dorsolateral nucleus and anterior nucleus. These nuclei of the thalamus receive information from mammillary bodies. There are two almond-shaped structures towards the end of the phonics known as mammillary bodies. They are part of the limbic system. So these mammillary bodies are part of the limbic system. You're going to look at where they are located. They are part of the limbic system. So information coming from them must go to the limbic nuclei. Nuclei concerned with coordination of information coming from the limbic system. They also receive information from what we call the hippocampus. When I told you to go and read about the parts of the limbic system, these are parts of the limbic system, the mammillary bodies and the hippocampus. This hippocampus is part of the medial aspect of the temporal lobe. Through the phonics, even the phonics is part of the limbic system. Now, when they receive information from these parts of the limbic system, the mammillary bodies, the hippocampus, and the phonics, information from these parts will go to the anterior nucleus and the dorsolateral nucleus, which are the limbic nuclei, because they receive information from the limbic system. Then these nuclei will transmit or project that information to what we call the cingulate gyrus of the cerebrum. Cingulate gyrus of the cerebrum. The cingulate gyrus of the cerebrum is that gyrus which is above the corpus callosum. And that information is concerned with the storing and keeping and processing memory. So we have classified thalamic nuclei into motor, into anatomical, and physiological. So the next step we are going to is the blood supply of the thalamus. And this is coming prematurely because the lecture for blood supply of the brain is going to come in later. However, it does not stop us from now, this is coming prematurely, but you're going to go and read about the blood supply of the brain. Special consideration, you look at the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis. But we shall also have a lecture on the blood supply of the brain. But I want to talk about a brief about the blood supply of the thalamus. This blood vessel is a basilar artery. It is formed by the joining of the two vertebral arteries. Vertebral arteries come from the subclavian, then they pass through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae, and then they enter the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum. Then they move along the medulla oblongata, those vertebral arteries. But when they reach the junction between the medulla oblongata and the pons, at the junction between the medulla oblongata and the pons, the two vertebral arteries join to form the basilar artery. And this basilar artery moves on the anterior surface of the pons, which it grooves. Then at the junction of the pons and the midbrain, the basilar artery finally bifurcates into the posterior cerebral arteries. This is the posterior cerebral artery. So we can see our basilar artery dividing into the posterior cerebral arteries. Of course, the basilar artery gives off other blood vessels, but it will finally bifurcate into the posterior cerebral arteries, one on the right and the other one on the left. Then the other blood vessel which brings blood to the brain is the internal carotid, this artery. It's a branch of the common carotid. So the internal carotid is going to enter the cranial cavity through the carotid canal, and when it reaches there, it's going to divide into what we call the middle cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery, and you can see that the posterior communicating artery is meeting the posterior cerebral. And then the other one, which is not shown, is known as the anterior cerebral artery. So our concern is in this posterior communicating artery. So the basilar divides into the posterior cerebral arteries, and the internal carotid comes and gives off the posterior communicating artery, which communicates with the posterior cerebral artery and other blood vessels. And this is what I'm also showing you here. This is the basilar artery, because we are going to show you only one thalamus. This is the basilar artery dividing into two posterior cerebral arteries. Let's go with one. This is the posterior cerebral artery on one side. The posterior cerebral artery has part 1 and part 2. When we go back here, this part before you reach the posterior communicating, this part before the posterior communicating joins the posterior cerebral. This part is part 1, and then this part beyond that point is part 2. And this is what we are showing you here. This is the posterior communicating, a branch of the internal carotid, the posterior communicating coming to meet the posterior cerebral. So this is part 1, and this is part 2. So the part 1 of the posterior cerebral artery gives off the thalamic subthalamic artery, which is going to supply the medial nuclei around there and parts of the posterior nuclei. The thalamic subthalamic artery. Part 2 is going to give off these two paired arteries known as the thalamo-geniculate arteries, which are going to go and supply the lateral nuclei. It's also going to give off this posterior choroidal artery, which is going to come and give branches to the posterior nuclei and transmit another branch to the anterior nucleus. So the thalamic subthalamic arteries, the thalamo-geniculate arteries, and the posterior choroidal arteries are the ones which are branches from the posterior cerebral. Part 1 gives off 1 and part 2 gives off 2. Then the posterior communicating also gives us the polar artery, which is going to supply also the lateral nuclei. So the major blood vessels is posterior cerebral and the posterior communicating. Posterior communicating is giving us 1. Posterior cerebral is giving us 1, 2, 3. What is happening on the right is the same as what is happening on the left. And that is how blood reaches the thalamus, because the thalamus must be well perfused with blood, because if its neurons die because of oxygen deprivation, you're going to be cut off from the cerebrum, because the thalamus is the gateway to the cerebrum. Finally, we saw that the thalamus receives information from different parts of the brain and then transmits it to the cortex. Then the cortex can also communicate with the thalamus so that it really rectifies. The cortex might receive information which is not clear, so it has to communicate with the thalamus to rectify whether what is coming is the true representation of what the thalamus intended. So the thalamus must send information to the cortex, and the cortex must also communicate with the thalamus. Because remember, when information reaches the thalamus transmits it to the cerebral cortex. But the cerebral cortex may not receive that information clearly, so it has also to communicate with the thalamus to rectify what is reaching it. So information going to the thalamus and coming to the thalamus is known as the thalamic radiation. Thalamic radiation refers to information going to the thalamus or coming from the thalamus information coming from the thalamus to go into the cortex, and information coming from the cortex coming to the thalamus, coming from the cortex towards the thalamus, is what we call thalamic radiation. I said information coming from the thalamus going to the cortex, and information coming back from the cortex to the thalamus constitutes what we call the thalamic radiation. Information coming from the thalamus to the cortex is known as thalamocortical. The axons are moving from the thalamus to the cortex. And information coming from the cortex to the thalamus is known as cortico-thalamic. So these are the two parts of the thalamic radiation. Now, when the thalamus is communicating with the frontal lobe is anterior. So the axons communicating with the frontal lobe are the axons coming from the thalamus communicating with the frontal lobe are moving anteriorly. So these axons are known as the anterior thalamic peduncle. Let's go back, let's look at the information. This is our thalamus. And we said that the thalamus receives information from different parts of the brain, of the central nervous system, and then transmits that information to the different areas of the cerebral cortex, depending on the function of that sensation. So information from the thalamus going to the frontal lobe, for example, motor, from the specific motor nuclei, because this is where we have the motor areas. Information passing through axons, moving from the thalamus to the frontal lobe and back. This information passes through axons which form a bundle, and this bundle is known as the anterior or frontal thalamic peduncle. An anterior or frontal thalamic peduncle refers to axons from the thalamus transmitting information from the frontal to the frontal lobe. This is what we call the anterior or frontal thalamic peduncle. Information coming from the thalamus moving to the temporal lobe, it might, most especially that one coming from the medial geniculate body, because the temporal lobe is the one which has the auditory areas. So those axons moving from the thalamus to the temporal lobe, we call them the inferior or temporal thalamic peduncle. Who can tell me these axons coming from the thalamus to the occipital lobe, which nucleus might they be coming from?
Lateral geniculate nucleus.
That geniculate body, because it is the one which receives visual stimuli and then sends them to occipital lobe. So when the axons are moving from the thalamus, from specifically mainly the lateral geniculate body, when those axons are moving from the lateral geniculate body, which is in the posterior aspect of the thalamus, to the occipital lobe, they pass through this bundle known as the posterior or occipital thalamic peduncle. And the ones which are going to the parietal lobe, where I have the sensory areas, which are coming from that ventral posterior, posterior lateral, and posterior medial, because this is where I have the sensory areas. These bundles coming from the ventral posterior nucleus, transmitting sensory information to the sensory areas of the parietal lobe. These axons pass through what we call the superior thalamic peduncle or the parietal thalamic peduncle. So much as the thalamus is transmitting impulses to the cerebrum, those impulses pass through axons, and the axons are grouped into the superior or parietal thalamic peduncle, anterior or frontal thalamic peduncle, inferior or temporal thalamic peduncle, posterior or occipital thalamic peduncle. And those are the ones I talked about here: anterior, frontal, anterior or frontal, superior or parietal, posterior or occipital, inferior or temporal. The rest you are going to read, and I'm going to upload these notes on the Podel platform. I